The November evening had settled over Ravenshollow Manor like a shroud, its ancient stones seeming to absorb the last vestiges of daylight with the hungry patience of centuries. Inside the grand drawing-room, however, warmth radiated from both the crackling fire and the peculiar tension that electrified the air between the assembled guests. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood, the recently widowed mistress of the estate, had summoned what she termed a small gathering of intimates for what would prove to be far more than a simple evening's entertainment. At 71, Mrs. Blackwood possessed the kind of formidable presence that commanded attention without effort. Her silver hair was arranged with mathematical precision, and her pale blue eyes held the calculating intelligence of a woman who had spent decades managing both vast wealth and complex human relationships. She stood before the marble fireplace, her black mourning dress a stark silhouette against the dancing flames, while in her hands she held an object that would soon become central to the evening's dark events. An antique hourglass of extraordinary craftsmanship. The timepiece itself was a thing of beauty and mystery. Its brass frame bore intricate engravings of serpentine patterns, while the glass bulbs contained not ordinary sand, but what appeared to be crushed obsidian, black as midnight and fine as powder. Local legend claimed it had belonged to a Venetian fortune-teller who had predicted her own death to the very hour. Mrs. Blackwood's late husband had acquired it at considerable expense, though she had always regarded it with a mixture of fascination and unease. It was at this moment that Hercule Poirot, accompanied by his faithful companion Captain Hastings, was announced by the butler. Their presence had been requested by Mrs. Blackwood herself, though for reasons she had not yet made clear. As they entered the drawing-room, Poirot's keen eyes immediately began their customary inventory of both the physical space and its human occupants. "Madame Blackwood," Poirot said, offering a precise bow, "you do us great honor with your invitation. Your home, it has the atmosphere of, how do you say, accumulated secrets." Mrs. Blackwood smiled thinly. "How perceptive of you, Monsieur Poirot. Indeed, secrets are rather the theme of this evening." She gestured toward the assembled company. "Allow me to present my family and closest associates." Poirot's gaze swept the room with the methodical precision of a master jeweler examining stones. There was Marcus Blackwood, the deceased's nephew and presumed heir, a man of 45 whose soft features and nervous habits spoke of a life lived in comfortable dependency. His wife, Celeste, possessed the practiced poise of former stage beauty, though Poirot noted the slight tremor in her hands and the way her eyes never quite met those of her husband. Dr. Edmund Fairfax, the family physician and Mrs. Blackwood's trusted advisor, presented the reassuring facade of medical competence, yet something in his manner suggested a man carrying the weight of uncomfortable knowledge. Miss Margaret Thornley, who had served as Mrs. Blackwood's companion and secretary for over a decade, displayed the anxious devotion of one whose security depended entirely upon another's goodwill. Finally, there was Penelope Ashworth, Mrs. Blackwood's great niece, a young woman of striking beauty whose restless energy and frequent glances toward the door suggested someone perpetually ready for flight. "My dear friends," Mrs. Blackwood began, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I have asked you here tonight because time, as we all know, is precious, and mine, I fear, grows short." She turned the hourglass in her hands, watching the black sand shift within its confines. "Dr. Fairfax will confirm that my recent medical consultations have been illuminating. 6 months, perhaps less." The silence that greeted this announcement was profound, broken only by Miss Thornley's sharp intake of breath and the soft ticking of the numerous clocks that adorn the room. "However," Mrs. Blackwood continued, "before I depart this world, there are certain matters that require resolution, certain truths that must be acknowledged." Her gaze moved deliberately from face to face. "You see, I have spent these past weeks observing, listening, and learning exactly what each of you truly thinks of me, and of each other. Poirot, who had positioned himself near a window where he could observe all present, noted the subtle but telling reactions. Marcus's involuntary start, Celeste's tightening grip on her wine-glass, Dr. Fairfax's sudden pallor, Miss Thornley's nervous wringing of hands, and young Penelope's barely concealed panic. "Tomorrow morning," Mrs. Blackwood announced, "my solicitor will arrive to witness certain changes to my will, changes that reflect my newfound understanding of human nature." She placed the hourglass upon the mantelpiece with deliberate ceremony. "But tonight we shall have what I call a truth-telling. Each of you will have the opportunity to confess your secrets before I make my final decisions." With theatrical precision, Mrs. Blackwood inverted the hourglass. The black sand began its inexorable journey from upper chamber to lower, each grain marking the passage of moments that would prove more precious than anyone present could imagine. "The sand will fall for exactly 1 hour," she declared. "When it stops, so too will my patience for deception. I suggest you use the time wisely." Poirot observed the scene with the intense concentration of a naturalist studying a particularly fascinating specimen. He noted how each person's attention was drawn irresistibly to the falling sand, as if mesmerized by the visible representation of their dwindling opportunities for redemption. The confessions, when they came, were delivered with varying degrees of reluctance and desperation. Marcus admitted to his gambling debts and his secret meetings with creditors. Celeste revealed her correspondence with a former lover who had been threatening exposure. Dr. Fairfax confessed to his concerns about Mrs. Blackwood's mental state and his discussions with Marcus about potential guardianship proceedings. Miss Thornley, in tears, acknowledged her systematic embezzlement of household funds over the past 3 years. Only Penelope remained silent, her face pale as parchment, her eyes fixed upon the hourglass, as if willing the sand to stop its relentless fall. As the final grains of sand approached the narrow waist of the hourglass, Mrs. Blackwood rose from her chair with evident satisfaction. "Well," she said, "that was most illuminating. I believe I now have all the information I require to—" Her words were cut short as she suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her throat. For a moment, she swayed like a tree in a strong wind, her eyes wide with surprise rather than pain. Then, with a soft sigh that seemed to echo the whisper of falling sand, she collapsed into her chair. Dr. Fairfax was at her side in an instant, his professional instincts overriding the evening's emotional turmoil. But even as he checked for a pulse that would not be found, even as he attempted resuscitation that would prove futile, the last grain of black sand completed its journey through the hourglass. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood was dead, and time, for her, had indeed run out. In the chaos that followed, the screams, the tears, the frantic telephone calls to authorities, only Hercule Poirot remained perfectly still, his grey eyes moving methodically around the room. He observed the overturned wine-glass near Mrs. Blackwood's chair, the peculiar expression frozen on her face, and most particularly the hourglass itself, now silent and still upon the mantelpiece. "Mon Dieu," he murmured to Hastings. "Observe how perfectly the timing aligns." Madame Blackwood spoke of truth-telling, but it appears that truth has claimed a most unexpected victim. This is no mere coincidence of natural death and theatrical timing, mon ami. No, this is murder most carefully planned and most ingeniously executed. As the local constabulary was summoned and the house sealed, Poirot began his preliminary observations. The locked drawing-room, the precise timing of death with the hourglass, the convenient assembly of suspects, each with compelling motives, all combined to create a puzzle that would demand every ounce of his legendary deductive powers. The widow's hourglass had measured its final hour, but for Hercule Poirot, the investigation was just beginning. In this room, filled with secrets, lies, and desperate people, one person had chosen murder as their solution, and Poirot would not rest until he had identified which of these seemingly grief-stricken mourners was, in fact, a cold-blooded killer The sand had stopped falling, but justice would not be so easily contained. The silence following Mrs. Blackwood's collapse shattered like crystal as Dr. Fairfax rose from his futile examination, his face bearing the grave expression of professional defeat. "She is gone," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of finality that only a physician can deliver. A cardiac episode, most certainly. The stress of this evening's revelations would have been more than sufficient to trigger such an event. Captain Hastings moved swiftly to the telephone, his military training asserting itself in the face of crisis, while Poirot remained motionless near the window, his grey eyes moving methodically around the room like a master jeweler examining precious stones for flaws. He noted the overturned wine-glass beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair, its pale contents spreading across the Persian carpet in an irregular stain, and observed how each person present had positioned themselves in relation to the deceased, some drawing closer in apparent concern, others instinctively retreating. Within minutes, the heavy oak doors admitted Inspector Caldwell of the local constabulary, a methodical man whose weathered features spoke of long experience with rural crimes and sudden deaths. His arrival brought with it the formal machinery of investigation, transforming the elegant drawing-room from a site of entertainment into a sealed crime scene. "Nobody leaves the premises," Inspector Caldwell announced with quiet authority, his gaze sweeping over the assembled company. "This room remains exactly as it is until we determine the circumstances of Mrs. Blackwood's death." Poirot approached the inspector with the courteous precision that marked all his interactions. "Inspector, if I may suggest, we should examine the scene with particular care. The timing of events this evening has been most remarkable." "How so, Monsieur Poirot?" "Consider, if you please, that Madame Blackwood spoke of changes to her will, demanded confessions from each person present, and then died at the precise moment when her hourglass completed its measurement of 1 hour. Poirot gestured toward the mantelpiece where the antique timepiece sat silent, its black sands settled in the lower chamber. Such precise timing suggests either extraordinary coincidence or careful planning. Dr. Fairfax stepped forward, his professional composure wavering slightly. "Surely you cannot suggest murder, Monsieur Poirot. Mrs. Blackwood suffered from severe cardiac irregularities. I had warned her repeatedly about the dangers of emotional stress." "Ah, mon docteur, but when did you last examine this irregular heart? When did you last observe these symptoms of which you speak with such certainty?" The physician hesitated. "Well, it has been some weeks since her formal examination, but her condition was well documented." "Indeed," Poirot murmured, moving closer to the hourglass. "Yet tonight, Madame Blackwood displayed remarkable vigor. Her voice was strong, her movements decisive, her mental acuity absolutely sharp. These are not the characteristics of a woman on death's threshold." Marcus Blackwood, who had been pacing near the windows with increasing agitation, suddenly stopped. "Are you suggesting that Aunt Victoria wasn't actually ill?" "But Dr. Fairfax said—" "Dr. Fairfax said many things," Poirot interrupted gently. "But what interests me more is what Madame Blackwood herself revealed. She spoke of 6 months, perhaps less. Yet she also planned to alter her will tomorrow morning. These are not the words of a woman resigned to immediate death." Miss Thornley looked up from her handkerchief with red-rimmed eyes. "But the timing, surely it's just terrible coincidence." Mrs. Blackwood always loved theatrical gestures. "Mademoiselle, you worked for Madame Blackwood for 10 years, no? In all that time, did you ever see her use this particular hourglass for entertainment? Did she ever employ it as a timing device?" Miss Thornley's face went pale. "No, never. She always said it made her uneasy. She kept it only because Mr. Blackwood had been fond of it. Yet tonight she made it the centerpiece of her performance," Poirot observed. "Most curious. Would you not agree?" Celeste Blackwood, who had maintained an unnatural composure throughout the evening, finally spoke. "What exactly are you implying, Monsieur Poirot?" "I imply nothing, madame. I merely observed that each person in this room had reason to fear Madame Blackwood's promised changes to her will. Each had secrets that, once revealed, might prove costly indeed. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of clocks and the sound of rain beginning against the windows. Inspector Caldwell cleared his throat, preparing to begin formal questioning, but Poirot held up one small, perfectly manicured hand. "If I may suggest, mon inspecteur, we should begin with the wine glass. For if this is indeed murder, as I begin to suspect, then the method was most likely poison, and the delivery system lies there beside Madame Blackwood's chair, waiting to tell us its story." The investigation had truly begun, and Poirot's little grey cells were already working to unravel the carefully constructed deception that had claimed Victoria Blackwood's life. Inspector Caldwell approached the overturned wine glass with the methodical precision of a man who understood that evidence, once disturbed, could never again tell its complete story. Poirot followed closely, his sharp eyes cataloguing every detail with the intensity of a master jeweler examining a precious stone for flaws. The pale liquid had spread across the Persian carpet in an irregular stain, its sweet aroma mingling with the lingering traces of Mrs. Blackwood's lavender perfume and the wood smoke from the dying fire. "Observe, Inspector," Poirot murmured, kneeling carefully beside the fallen glass without disturbing it. "The pattern of the spill suggests the glass was not merely dropped from nerveless fingers, but cast aside with considerable force. Yet Madame Blackwood showed no signs of violent convulsion when she collapsed." Using his handkerchief, Caldwell lifted the crystal glass to examine it more closely. A thin residue clung to its bottom, something that caught the lamplight with an oily sheen quite different from the pale wine that had filled it. "There's something here that doesn't belong," he observed grimly. Dr. Fairfax stepped forward, his medical training compelling him despite his obvious discomfort. "Inspector, surely you cannot suspect poison. Mrs. Blackwood's cardiac condition was well documented. The stress of this evening's revelations would have been more than sufficient to trigger a fatal episode." "Ah, mon docteur," Poirot replied with gentle firmness, rising to his full height. "But you examined Madame Blackwood immediately after her collapse, did you not? Tell me, what specific symptoms of cardiac distress did you observe? The cyanosis of lips and fingernails, the distension of neck veins, the irregular, thready pulse that precedes cardiac arrest?" The physician's face grew noticeably pale. "Well, by the time I reached her side, she had already, that is to say, such symptoms would have subsided once the heart had stopped. Or perhaps," Poirot suggested quietly, his grey eyes never leaving the doctor's face, "there were no such symptoms to observe because the cause of death was not cardiac failure at all." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle hiss of settling coals in the fireplace. Each person present seemed to shrink slightly, as if the weight of suspicion had suddenly descended upon them all. Poirot moved toward the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair, where a crystal decanter caught the firelight with amber brilliance. Its stopper sat slightly askew as though replaced in haste. "Tell me, who prepared this cordial for Madame Blackwood?" Miss Thornley looked up from her sodden handkerchief with red-rimmed eyes. "I placed the decanter there at Mrs. Blackwood's instruction, but Reeves brought it up from the kitchen. Cook prepared it, elderflower and lemon syrup with a few drops of Dr. Fairfax's tonic for her nerves." "And this tonic, Doctor, what does it contain?" Dr. Fairfax cleared his throat nervously. "Nothing harmful. Gentian root, a trace of valerian for relaxation. I recommended it a fortnight ago when she complained of poor sleep." "Yet tonight," Poirot observed, "Madame Blackwood displayed remarkable vigor. Her voice was strong, her mental acuity absolutely sharp, her movements decisive. These are hardly the characteristics of a woman suffering from severe cardiac distress. Would you not agree?" Before the doctor could respond, Poirot's attention was drawn to something else entirely. On the linen cloth beneath the decanter, a faint ring marked where another vessel had recently stood. too small for the decanter's base, too large for a simple wine glass. "Inspector, something has been removed from this table since Madame Blackwood's collapse, a small container of some sort." The assembled company exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Poirot moved to the mantelpiece where the hourglass sat in silent testimony to the evening's events. Leaning closer without touching it, he noticed a faint smudge along its lower brass rim, a delicate black mark that matched a similar stain on Mrs. Blackwood's right index finger. "You touched the hourglass, madame," he said softly, as though the deceased might answer. "You inverted it to begin your theatrical hour, and perhaps you steadied it later. But see—" He gestured to the fine black sand visible through the glass. "This obsidian powder, it clings when disturbed, especially in damp air." Inspector Caldwell began organizing his constables to collect and seal the evidence while Poirot continued his methodical examination. "If I may suggest, Inspector, we should conduct individual interviews while the shock of events has not yet hardened into rehearsed explanations. Grief and fear have a way of loosening tongues, but only for a brief time." The first to be questioned was Dr. Fairfax, led to the quiet privacy of the library, where leather-bound volumes seemed to absorb sound and secrets with equal efficiency. Seated across from the doctor, Poirot began not with accusations, but with gentle observations. "You have been Madame Blackwood's physician for many years, no? You knew her habits, her fears, her physical condition better than anyone present tonight." "Indeed," Fairfax replied, though his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Victoria was a difficult patient, strong-willed, often refusing to follow medical advice. And yet you told Monsieur Marcus that guardianship proceedings might be necessary. This suggests a woman whose mental faculties were compromised, does it not?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. Her judgment had become erratic. The decision to gather everyone tonight, for instance, was highly unusual. And her obsession with that macabre hourglass. "Curious," Poirot mused. "One moment you describe her as mentally unsound enough to warrant guardianship. The next, you acknowledge her lucidity in planning tonight's gathering and her intention to alter her will. These seem contradictory assessments, mon docteur." Fairfax's face flushed. Her condition was variable. Moments of clarity followed by periods of confusion. "How convenient," Poirot observed with a slight smile that did not reach his eyes. "And regarding the changes she planned to make to her will, did you have knowledge of their nature? Would they perhaps have affected your own position as her trusted advisor?" "Certainly not," Fairfax protested too quickly. "My concern was purely for Victoria's well-being." When Marcus Blackwood was brought in next, his nervous energy filled the small room like static electricity. His confession to gambling debts had clearly cost him considerable effort, and now he faced the prospect of being suspected of murder. "Your financial difficulties," Poirot began without preamble. "They were substantial enough to make your aunt's continued generosity a matter of survival. Were they not?" Marcus rubbed his hands together anxiously. "Aunt Victoria was unpredictable. One day she'd threaten to cut me off entirely. The next, she'd pay my creditors without a word. I never knew where I stood. A precarious position for a man with pressing obligations. And your wife, did Madame Celeste share your anxieties about the will?" "Celeste worries, as any wife would. She hoped Aunt Victoria would do right by us." "By which you mean ensure your continued comfortable existence," Poirot finished. "Tell me about these discussions of guardianship with Dr. Fairfax. Were they truly for your aunt's benefit, or did they offer a more immediate solution to your problems?" Marcus's jaw tightened visibly. She was becoming impossible, Monsieur Poirot, truly impossible to manage. As the interviews continued, Poirot began to see the intricate web of motives and deceptions that had surrounded Victoria Blackwood in her final hour. Each person had secrets, each had reasons to fear her promised revelations, and each had access to the cordial that had likely delivered death in a crystal glass. But murder Poirot knew, required more than motive and opportunity. It required a mind capable of cold calculation and perfect timing. As he prepared to question the remaining suspects, his little grey cells were already beginning to discern the pattern hidden beneath the surface of grief and shock. A pattern that would soon reveal which of these seemingly mourning relatives was, in fact, a calculating killer. As the interviews progressed, Poirot found himself constructing an increasingly complex portrait of the deceased Mrs. Blackwood, a woman who had wielded secrets like weapons and inspired both dependency and resentment in equal measure. The library's leather-bound silence seemed to encourage confession, yet each revelation only deepened the mystery surrounding her. Precisely timed death. Miss Margaret Thornley entered next, her composure finally cracking under the weight of the evening's events. She settled into the chair with the careful movements of someone accustomed to occupying only the space granted by others, her red-rimmed eyes reflecting a decade of faithful service now shadowed by guilt. "Mademoiselle," Poirot began gently, "your confession of embezzlement tonight. This was most courageous. Tell me, how did Madame Blackwood discover your financial arrangements?" "She didn't, not exactly," Miss Thornley whispered, dabbing at her eyes. "But she had been asking questions lately, about the household accounts, about small discrepancies. I feared she was beginning to suspect. And the amount, £300 over 3 years. This represented a considerable risk to your position and reputation." "Everything, Monsieur Poirot. If she had dismissed me, pressed charges, I have nowhere else to go, no family except my invalid sister, no other skills except what I've learned in service here." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Yet tonight, when she demanded truth-telling, you chose to confess voluntarily. Why not remain silent and hope she had not yet discovered your activities?" Miss Thornley's hands twisted her handkerchief into knots. "Because I knew she knew. The way she looked at me when she spoke of secrets and deceptions. She was giving us all one final chance to redeem ourselves before tomorrow's will changes." "And you believed confession might earn you forgiveness?" "I hoped," she said simply. "Mrs. Blackwood could be harsh, but she respected honesty. I thought perhaps—" When Celeste Blackwood entered, her theatrical training was evident in every calculated movement. She arranged herself with practiced grace, though Poirot noted the slight tremor in her hands that no amount of stage experience could entirely suppress. "Madame Celeste," Poirot began, "your confession tonight concerned correspondence with a former lover. This must have caused considerable anxiety." "Ancient history," she replied with studied nonchalance, though her voice carried an underlying tension. "A foolish indiscretion from my theatrical days. Yet significant enough to warrant blackmail, no? And serious enough to threaten your position in this household should it become known." Celeste's composure flickered. "The letters were intimate in nature, written during a difficult period in my marriage. If they had become public, it would have caused embarrassment. Or perhaps something more concrete than embarrassment. Financial consequences, should your husband learn of their true contents." "Marcus knows about them now," she said quickly. "I told him everything tonight." "Did you, madame? Or did you tell him only what Madame Blackwood already knew?" Poirot's grey eyes studied her carefully. "There is, I think, a difference between confession and damage control." Before she could respond, he shifted direction. "Tell me about the cordial this evening. You observed Madame Blackwood drinking from her glass?" "Several times throughout the evening. She seemed to find it soothing during the more difficult moments of the truth-telling." "And who approached the decanter during the evening?" Celeste hesitated. Miss Thornley refreshed it once. Dr. Fairfax was near it when he checked on Mrs. Blackwood earlier, perhaps 20 minutes before she collapsed. She had complained of feeling dizzy. This detail struck Poirot as significant. And she followed his advice to take some cordial. Yes, she drank perhaps half a glass, but then she seemed to recover and continued with her performance. When Dr. Fairfax was brought back for additional questioning, his earlier composure had noticeably deteriorated. His hands showed a slight tremor, and his eyes avoided direct contact with Poirot's penetrating gaze. "Doctor, you mentioned earlier that you had recommended the nerve tonic a fortnight ago. Yet Mademoiselle Thornley tells me you delivered a fresh bottle this very afternoon. Why was this necessary?" Fairfax cleared his throat nervously. "The previous bottle was nearly empty. I thought it best to ensure she had an adequate supply, given her recent agitation. And you gave specific instructions about its use. 3 drops only, mixed with her evening cordial. The tincture is quite potent. More could be dangerous." "Dangerous in what way, precisely?" "Cardiac irregularities, respiratory depression. In someone with Mrs. Blackwood's condition, an overdose could prove fatal." Poirot made a careful note. "Most interesting. And this fresh bottle, it was sealed when you delivered it?" "Certainly. I am most particular about such matters." As the interviews concluded, Poirot returned to the drawing room where Inspector Caldwell was carefully cataloguing the evidence. The detective's keen eyes moved once more around the scene, noting details that had previously escaped attention. The faint ring on the table where something had been removed, the precise positioning of the overturned glass, the way the hourglass caught the firelight with its brass fittings. Each person questioned had revealed compelling motives for wanting Mrs. Blackwood silenced before her promised will changes could take effect. Yet murder required more than desperation. It demanded opportunity, method, and the cold calculation to act when the moment presented itself. As Poirot prepared for the next phase of his investigation, his little gray cells were beginning to discern patterns within the web of secrets and lies, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of reach. The evening's revelations had created a complex web of motives and opportunities, but Poirot's methodical mind demanded a thorough examination of the physical evidence before drawing conclusions. With Inspector Caldwell's permission, he descended to the kitchen where the lingering aromas of lemon and elderflower provided a stark contrast to the grim business above stairs. Cook, a robust woman whose flour-dusted apron spoke of decades in service, answered his questions with the straightforward honesty of one who had nothing to hide. "Made the cordial at 5 o'clock sharp, sir, just as Mrs. Blackwood liked it. Equal parts elderflower syrup and water, fresh lemon juice, chilled proper on the scullery shelf. Nothing else added. Never would be, not from my kitchen." "And who collected this cordial for service upstairs?" "Reeves took it up on the silver tray along with the crystal glasses just before 8. Went straight to the drawing room, it did." Reeves himself, summoned from his duties, provided additional details with a precise diction that marked a lifetime of proper service. "I placed the decanter and glasses as Cook prepared them, sir. Later in the evening, Miss Thornley requested additional glasses from the sideboard, and Dr. Fairfax inquired about the nerve tonic. I placed the doctor's bottle on the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair at his specific request. And after Madame Blackwood's collapse, what became of this bottle?" The butler's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "I cannot account for it, sir. When I returned with smelling salts, the bottle was no longer on the table." Returning to the drawing room, Poirot found that the preliminary forensic examination had yielded disturbing results. The wineglass contained traces of digitalis, a cardiac medication that, in concentrated doses, could prove fatal. More damning still, a search of Miss Thornley's belongings had revealed a small vial containing the same substance. Inspector Caldwell seemed satisfied with this discovery. "The evidence is quite clear, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Thornley had motive, opportunity, and now we find the murder weapon in her possession." But Poirot's final interview with Penelope Ashworth revealed information that cast the entire evening in a different light. The young woman's composure finally cracked as she confessed her deepest secret. "I'm with child," she whispered, her hands trembling. "James Whitmore. He's a clerk in the village post office. Great-aunt Victoria discovered our relationship and forbade me to see him. She threatened complete disinheritance if I continued the association. Her voice broke. She said she would not permit her fortune to support my bastard offspring. This revelation provided Penelope with perhaps the strongest motive of all, not just financial ruin, but social disgrace and the inability to support her unborn child. Yet she also provided a crucial observation. During the evening, when great-aunt complained of dizziness, Dr. Fairfax suggested she take cordial to steady her nerves, but she seemed suspicious at first, held the glass for several minutes before drinking. Then, when she began her final speech about tomorrow's will changes, she drained it entirely. More significantly, Penelope had noticed something others had missed. After Dr. Fairfax moved away from the table, Celeste went to great-aunt and said something about taking a little more to calm her nerves. I couldn't see exactly what she did, but she stood with her back to us, and when she returned to her seat, she laughed, too quickly, as if trying to hurry everyone past the moment. As Poirot examined the hourglass more closely, he discovered additional evidence of tampering. The brass fittings showed tiny scratches around the connection points, suggesting someone had recently opened the chambers. Under magnification, the black sand revealed foreign particles, crystalline substances that didn't belong in crushed obsidian. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "I believe we are being presented with a most elaborate deception. The evidence against Miss Thornley is perhaps too convenient. A frightened woman who admits to embezzlement would hardly retain the murder weapon in her handbag after committing such a crime." Dr. Fairfax's medical bag, discovered in the entrance hall, contained a partially spilled bottle of concentrated digitalis tincture. The physician claimed to have found it tampered with, though Poirot noted the convenient timing of this discovery. "The symptoms of digitalis poisoning," Fairfax explained nervously, "would initially present as dizziness, followed by apparent recovery, then sudden cardiac collapse as the toxin reached full concentration in the bloodstream. The entire process would require approximately 15 minutes. This timing corresponded exactly with Mrs. Blackwood's final quarter hour. From her complaint of dizziness through her dramatic final speech to her precisely timed death as the hourglass emptied. "Non, mes amis," Poirot concluded, his grey eyes sharp with determination. "This murder was planned with extraordinary care, using the hourglass not merely for theatrical effect, but as perfect misdirection." While all eyes watched the falling sand, the real killer moved with calculated precision. The truth lies not in the obvious evidence, but in the psychological game that has been played upon us all. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, and Poirot sensed the murderer's growing desperation would soon force the crucial mistake that would expose their carefully constructed deception. The physical evidence was beginning to tell its own story, and Poirot's methodical examination of the hourglass revealed details that had escaped initial notice. Under the magnifying glass Inspector Caldwell provided, the brass fittings showed not merely scratches, but the precise tool marks of someone who had carefully opened the timepiece's chambers. More intriguingly, the black obsidian sand contained foreign particles, crystalline fragments that caught the lamplight with an oily sheen quite different from the matte darkness of crushed volcanic glass. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, his fingers hovering over the evidence without touching it, "observe these foreign substances mixed within the sand. They are not decorative additions. They serve a purpose. Someone has contaminated this hourglass with powdered digitalis, ensuring that anyone handling it would transfer traces to their clothing, their skin, their personal effects." The implication struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Miss Thornley's face went ashen as she stared at her own hands, remembering how she had steadied the hourglass when placing it upon the mantelpiece earlier in the evening. Dr. Fairfax unconsciously wiped his palms against his waistcoat, while Celeste's theatrical composure finally showed hairline cracks. "You see," Poirot continued, moving to the small table where the mysterious ring marked the linen cloth, The killer understood that in a household investigation, everyone would be searched, everyone's belongings examined. How better to deflect suspicion than to ensure multiple people bore traces of the poison? The hourglass became not merely a timing device, but a method of contaminating evidence. Marcus Blackwood, his gambling debts momentarily forgotten in the face of this revelation, leaned forward with desperate intensity. But surely the real murderer would have taken precautions. Worn gloves, perhaps. Précisément, Monsieur Marcus. Which brings us to the missing bottle from Dr. Fairfax's collection. Poirot's grey eyes moved methodically around the room, noting how each person's attention was drawn irresistibly to his words. The killer removed it not to hide the murder weapon, but to plant it elsewhere, in the belongings of someone they wished to incriminate. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Each person present seemed to shrink slightly, as if the weight of suspicion had suddenly descended upon them all. Inspector Caldwell cleared his throat. "The digitalis found in Miss Thornley's handbag. You're suggesting it was planted there?" "I am suggesting, mon inspecteur, that a frightened woman who confesses to embezzlement would hardly retain the murder weapon in her personal effects after committing such a crime. The placement is too convenient, too obvious for someone with genuine guilt to hide." Poirot moved to the writing desk, where Mrs. Blackwood had kept her correspondence. The blotter still bore the faint impressions of recent writing, and when held to the lamplight, revealed the ghostly outline of words written in reverse. "Solicitor arrives 10, testament sealed noon." The timing was crucial. Mrs. Blackwood had planned to finalize her will, changes the very morning after her death. The killer knew of these plans, Poirot observed, replacing the blotter with apparent casualness. They understood that time was running short, that action must be taken before tomorrow's legal proceedings could be completed. Dr. Fairfax shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his medical bag clutched protectively in his lap. "Surely you cannot suspect everyone present, Monsieur Poirot. The evidence must point somewhere specific." "Indeed it does, mon docteur, but evidence, like a stage performance, can be carefully arranged to create desired impressions. The true artist of deception understands that the most compelling lie contains elements of truth, that the most effective misdirection uses genuine facts, arranged in misleading patterns." Penelope Ashworth, who had remained silent throughout much of the questioning, suddenly spoke. The timing of everything, the hourglass, the confessions, even Aunt Victoria's collapse, it all felt rehearsed somehow, as if someone had planned every moment. "Mademoiselle Penelope makes an astute observation," Poirot acknowledged. "This crime required not only knowledge of poisons and their effects, but intimate understanding of human psychology, of how people behave under emotional stress, of how to manipulate both timing and attention." He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust in the quiet room. The murderer understood that in creating multiple suspects with compelling motives, the obvious solution would obscure the true one. They gambled on our human tendency to see what we expect to see, to accept the most dramatic explanation rather than the most logical one. The psychological pressure was mounting, and Poirot could sense the growing desperation in the room. Someone among them had committed murder with extraordinary calculation, and that same calculating mind was now working frantically to maintain the deception. But pressure, like water against a dam, would eventually find the weakest point and break through. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, and Poirot's little grey cells were beginning to discern the pattern hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. The psychological pressure mounting in the room was almost tangible, each person's carefully maintained composure beginning to show hairline cracks under Poirot's methodical scrutiny. It was at this crucial moment that Captain Hastings, who had spent the evening quietly observing from his position near the door, stepped forward with information that would prove instrumental in unraveling the carefully constructed deception. "Poirot," he said quietly, his military bearing evident in his precise delivery. While you were conducting the interviews, I took the liberty of speaking with the household staff. The upstairs maid mentioned something rather curious about this afternoon's activities. Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with immediate interest, his attention focusing with the intensity of a jeweler examining a particularly promising stone. Indeed, mon ami. What did she observe that has captured your attention? She was cleaning the drawing room around 3 o'clock when someone entered and spent considerable time examining the hourglass on the mantelpiece. She found it peculiar because Mrs. Blackwood had always strictly forbidden the staff from handling it, claimed it was too delicate and valuable for routine cleaning. The revelation sent a visible tremor through the assembled company. Dr. Fairfax's hands tightened unconsciously on his medical bag, while Celeste's theatrical composure showed new signs of strain around her carefully controlled features. Marcus resumed his nervous pacing, his agitation filling the room like electricity before a storm. "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, moving closer to the hourglass itself. "And this person, did the maid identify them specifically?" She observed them from behind, working intently at the mantelpiece with what appeared to be small tools. Hastings continued, his voice carrying the weight of significant revelation. When they heard her approaching footsteps, they quickly moved away and left the room without the customary acknowledgement. Most unusual behavior for this household, where courtesy to staff is strictly observed by all family members. Inspector Caldwell looked up from his evidence, cataloguing with renewed interest. "This suggests premeditation, someone preparing the murder weapon hours before the actual crime." "Précisément, Inspector," Poirot agreed, his fingers hovering near the hourglass without touching its brass fittings. "But observe also the psychological sophistication required. The killer understood that contaminating the timepiece with digitalis would ensure multiple people bore traces of the poison, making the evidence against any single suspect less conclusive." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Each person present seemed to draw inward, as if the weight of suspicion had suddenly descended upon them all with renewed force. Miss Thornley, who had been quietly weeping into her handkerchief, suddenly looked up with a mixture of hope and terror. Could it mean that someone deliberately placed that vial in my belongings? That I was meant to be suspected? "The evidence strongly suggests such a possibility, mademoiselle," Poirot replied with gentle firmness. "A frightened woman who confesses to embezzlement would hardly retain the murder weapon in her personal effects after committing such a grave crime. The placement was too convenient, too obvious for genuine guilt to conceal." Dr. Fairfax shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his professional composure wavering under the mounting scrutiny. "Surely you cannot suspect everyone present based on household gossip and circumstantial observations. Victoria died of cardiac failure. I examined her condition myself immediately after her collapse." "Ah, mon docteur," Poirot replied, his tone remaining courteous, but carrying an edge of steel. "But your examination was conducted after the symptoms of digitalis poisoning would perfectly mimic those of natural cardiac arrest. Most convenient for someone with medical knowledge to obscure the true cause of death from casual observation." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, and Poirot noted with scientific precision how each person's reaction revealed aspects of their character under extreme duress. Penelope sat rigid with barely controlled panic, her pregnancy making her doubly vulnerable to scandal and exposure. Marcus's gambling debts had clearly left him desperate enough to consider any solution to his mounting financial pressures. But it was Celeste who commanded Poirot's most intense scrutiny. Her theatrical training had served her admirably throughout the evening's ordeal. Yet now he observed the subtle signs of someone fighting desperately to maintain a performance under impossible circumstances. Her breathing was too measured, her posture too perfectly controlled, her responses too carefully calculated for genuine grief or spontaneous shock. The killer understood. Poirot continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. that success depended not merely on administering poison, but on creating what you might call a perfect storm of misdirection. Multiple suspects with compelling motives, contaminated evidence that would confuse the investigation, and precise timing that would make the murder appear either natural or the obvious work of someone else entirely. The psychological net was tightening with each carefully chosen word, and Poirot could sense the murderer's growing desperation beneath their maintained facade. Soon, the carefully constructed deception would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions, revealing the calculating mind that had orchestrated Mrs. Blackwood's precisely timed death with such theatrical precision. The psychological pressure mounting in the room had reached a critical threshold, and Poirot could sense the delicate balance between maintained composure and complete collapse that marked the final stages of his most complex investigations. Each person present seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the next revelation that might either exonerate or condemn them. It was at this precise moment that his methodical examination of the physical evidence yielded the crucial detail that would unlock the entire mystery. Returning once more to the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair, Poirot knelt with his magnifying glass, examining not just the telltale ring on the linen cloth, but the polished mahogany surface beneath it. What he discovered there was so minute, so easily overlooked, that even Inspector Caldwell's thorough cataloguing had missed it entirely. A microscopic scratch marred the otherwise perfect surface, not the circular mark of a glass base, but a fine, linear abrasion that spoke of something with a sharp, metallic edge. "Most illuminating," he murmured to himself, though his words carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere. The scratch was consistent with a small, specialized container, something designed for precise measurement and controlled dispensing. This was not the mark left by Dr. Fairfax's standard medicine bottle, nor by any of the crystal glasses or decanters present in the room. Rising to his full height, Poirot's gray eyes swept the assembled company with renewed understanding. The digitalis powder in the hourglass, the planted bottle in Miss Thornley's belongings, even the spilled tonic in Dr. Fairfax's medical bag, all were elaborate misdirection designed to obscure the true method of murder. The real killer had used a different delivery system entirely, one that allowed for precise timing and concentrated dosing. "Inspector," he said, quietly, "I believe we have been approaching this investigation from the wrong premise entirely. We have assumed that tonight's confessions were the catalyst for murder, that someone killed to prevent their secrets from influencing tomorrow's will changes." Dr. Fairfax shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his medical training compelling him to follow Poirot's reasoning despite his obvious discomfort. "Are you suggesting that Victoria's death was not connected to this evening's revelations?" "I am suggesting, mon docteur, that Madame Blackwood was far more cunning than any of you realized. The evidence indicates that her decisions regarding the will were made days, perhaps weeks ago. Tonight's gathering was not about discovering secrets. She already knew them all." This revelation sent a visible tremor through the room. Marcus stopped his nervous pacing entirely, while Celeste's carefully maintained theatrical composure showed new hairline cracks around her controlled features. Miss Thornley looked up from her handkerchief with a mixture of hope and terror, and Penelope's face went even paler than before. "But then why?" Marcus asked, with barely controlled desperation. "Would she stage such an elaborate performance if she already knew everything?" "Because, Monsieur Marcus, she understood that knowledge is power, but that the timing of revelation is everything. Tonight's theatrical display served a different purpose. It was designed to force the guilty party to reveal themselves through their actions under extreme psychological pressure." Poirot moved to the mantelpiece where the hourglass sat in silent testimony to the evening's carefully orchestrated events. "Consider the extraordinary precision required for this crime. The killer needed not only to administer poison, but to ensure it took effect at the exact moment the hourglass completed its measurement. This required intimate knowledge of both the poison's effects and the victim's habits. The microscopic scratch on the table, combined with the oily residue found in Mrs. Blackwood's glass, painted a clear picture of the true murder method. While everyone's attention was focused on the dramatic hourglass and the unfolding confessions, the killer had used a specialized container to deliver a concentrated dose of digitalis directly into the victim's individual glass. The timing of Mrs. Blackwood's initial dizziness, her apparent recovery, and her final collapse had been orchestrated with theatrical precision. The murderer understood, Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, that success depended not merely on administering poison, but on creating what you might call a perfect storm of misdirection. Multiple suspects with compelling motives, contaminated evidence that would confuse the investigation, and precise timing that would make the murder appear either natural or the obvious work of someone else entirely. Inspector Caldwell looked up from his evidence cataloging with growing interest. You're saying this was planned well in advance? Planned, executed, and disguised with extraordinary sophistication, Poirot confirmed. The killer knew that Mrs. Blackwood had already made her final decisions about the will. They murdered not to prevent discovery of their secrets, but because they knew their disinheritance was inevitable. Tonight's performance was their final opportunity to act. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Each person present seemed to draw inward, as if the weight of this revelation had suddenly made their individual guilt or innocence irrelevant compared to the calculating mind that had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. Poirot's little grey cells had finally assembled the crucial pieces of the puzzle. The microscopic scratch, the sophisticated timing, the multiple layers of misdirection, all pointed to a killer of extraordinary cunning and cold calculation. But he would not reveal his conclusions yet. The psychological game was entering its final phase, and the murderer's growing desperation would soon force the crucial mistake that would expose their carefully constructed facade completely. The widow's hourglass had measured its final hour, but justice would demand its own precise timing. The revelation that Mrs. Blackwood had orchestrated the entire evening with full knowledge of everyone's secrets created a new and more sinister dynamic in the room. The psychological pressure that had been building throughout the investigation now reached a critical threshold, and Poirot could observe with scientific precision how each suspect's carefully maintained composure began to show hairline cracks under this unexpected revelation. Dr. Fairfax was the first to break the mounting silence, his medical training compelling him to seek rational explanations, even as his personal anxiety became increasingly evident. If Victoria had already made her decisions, then this entire evening was, what? Some elaborate form of psychological torture? Not torture, mon docteur, Poirot replied with gentle precision, his grey eyes moving methodically around the room. Strategy. Madame Blackwood understood that knowledge without confession is merely suspicion. She needed documented evidence of your various transgressions to justify her final decisions. More importantly, she understood that one person in this room would choose murder rather than accept the inevitable consequences. The implications struck each person present with varying degrees of horror. Marcus resumed his agitated pacing, his gambling debts now seeming almost trivial compared to the possibility that his aunt had anticipated her own murder. Celeste's theatrical composure showed new signs of strain as she realized her carefully rehearsed confession had been a meaningless performance for an audience that already knew her secrets. Miss Thornley looked up from her sodden handkerchief with dawning comprehension. You mean she knew about the embezzlement all along? She was simply waiting for me to confess. Indeed, mademoiselle. Your employer possessed extraordinary observational skills. The household accounts, the mysterious correspondence, the gambling debts, even Mademoiselle Penelope's delicate condition, all were known to her weeks before tonight's gathering. Penelope's face went ashen at this revelation, her hands instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. But if she knew everything, why create such an elaborate charade? Because, ma petite, she understood that her killer would be forced to act tonight, knowing their disinheritance was inevitable. She created the perfect conditions: a closed room, precise timing, and multiple witnesses to observe behavior under extreme duress. Inspector Caldwell looked up from his evidence, cataloguing with renewed interest. "You're suggesting Mrs. Blackwood anticipated her own murder?" "I am suggesting she understood that one person in this room possessed both the desperation and the capability to kill rather than face complete ruin. She provided them with the opportunity, knowing their desperation would overcome their caution." Poirot moved to the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair, kneeling once more to examine the microscopic scratch with his magnifying glass. Under the lamplight, the linear abrasion told its story with scientific precision, not the circular mark of a glass base, but the sharp, deliberate scratch of specialized metal equipment. "Observe, Inspector," he said quietly. "This mark was made by something designed for precise measurement and controlled dispensing. Not Dr. Fairfax's standard medicine bottle, not any of the crystal glasses or decanters present. Something smaller, more specialized, more easily concealed." Rising to his full height, Poirot's attention was drawn to a detail that had previously escaped notice. On the Persian carpet near Mrs. Blackwood's chair, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look, was a tiny crystalline residue that caught the firelight with an oily sheen quite different from spilled cordial or wine. "Most illuminating," he murmured, carefully collecting the minute particles with his handkerchief. "Concentrated digitalis leaves distinctive traces when dispensed from a pressurized container. The killer used something far more sophisticated than simple powder or liquid. They employed a device that could deliver a precise, concentrated dose at exactly the right moment." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Each person present seemed to shrink slightly, as if the weight of this revelation had suddenly made their individual secrets irrelevant compared to the calculating mind that had orchestrated such an elaborate deception. "The murderer," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, understood that success required not merely administering poison, but creating what you might call a perfect storm of misdirection. They contaminated the hourglass to ensure multiple suspects bore traces of digitalis. They planted evidence to implicate Miss Thornley. They even arranged for Dr. Fairfax's medical supplies to appear tampered with. The psychological net was tightening with each carefully chosen word, and Poirot could sense the murderers' growing desperation beneath their maintained facade. Someone in this room had committed murder with extraordinary calculation, and that same calculating mind was now working frantically to maintain their deception. But Poirot's little grey cells had finally assembled the crucial pieces of this elaborate puzzle. The microscopic evidence, the sophisticated timing, the multiple layers of misdirection, all pointed to a killer of extraordinary cunning and cold determination. The moment of final revelation was approaching, and with it, the exposure of a murderer whose calculating mind had orchestrated death with theatrical precision. The widow's hourglass had measured its final hour, but justice would demand its own precise timing. The psychological pressure that had been mounting throughout the evening reached a crescendo as Poirot allowed the silence to stretch until it became its own form of interrogation. The rain had softened to a steady whisper against the windows, while the fire settled upon itself with occasional sparks, and the numerous clocks maintained their impartial chorus as if to remind the assembled company that time, though manipulated by human hands this night, would not be cheated of its final accounting. With a slight inclination of his head toward Inspector Caldwell, Poirot began to arrange the chairs in the precise positions they had occupied during Mrs. Blackwood's final moments. "We will reconstruct, if you please, the last quarter hour of Madame's life," he announced quietly. Not for theatrical effect non, but to restore proper order to a sequence that has been deliberately confused by our killer. The company obeyed with varying degrees of reluctance, each person returning to their former positions like actors, resuming their places on a stage. Marcus took his position near the window where he had paced nervously, while Celeste arranged herself on the chaise at the precise angle from which she had offered her sympathetic murmurs. Miss Thornley sat near the writing desk, her hands still clenched around her crumpled handkerchief, and Dr. Fairfax positioned himself within easy reach of the small table where he had checked on his patient. Penelope, pale and rigid with anxiety, took her seat near the far armrest, her eyes fixed upon the silent hourglass. At the commencement of Madame Blackwood's final statements, Poirot began, his grey eyes moving methodically around the recreated scene. She inverted the hourglass to begin her theatrical hour. Dr. Fairfax, you approached when she complained of dizziness, did you not? I did, the physician answered, though his voice carried a note of defensive uncertainty. She mentioned feeling momentarily faint. And you advised cordial for her nerves, which she accepted after some hesitation, Poirot continued with mathematical precision. Mademoiselle Penelope observed this interaction, as did others present. Then followed the interlude of confessions and protestations, during which one person approached the small table containing the decanter and Mrs. Blackwood's individual glass. The crystalline residue that Poirot had collected earlier now revealed its secrets under closer examination. Inspector Caldwell's magnifying glass showed not merely traces of digitalis, but the telltale signs of a sophisticated pharmaceutical compound, something that required specialized knowledge and professional access to medical supplies. Inspector, Poirot observed quietly, this residue contains stabilizing agents used only in concentrated medical preparations. This is not something available through ordinary channels. It demands both professional knowledge and access to specialized equipment. Moving to the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair, Poirot knelt to examine once more the microscopic scratch that had initially caught his attention. Under the lamplight, the linear abrasion told its story with scientific precision. Not the circular mark of a glass base, but the deliberate impression of something designed for precise measurement and controlled dispensing. The killer employed a device far more sophisticated than simple powder or liquid poison, he explained, rising to his full height. Something that could deliver a concentrated dose at exactly the predetermined moment, then disappear without leaving obvious evidence of its existence. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft ticking of the numerous clocks and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Each person present seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the revelation that would either exonerate or condemn them. But observe, Poirot continued, his attention moving to details that had previously escaped notice. The true genius of this crime lay not merely in the method of delivery, but in the psychological manipulation that surrounded it. The contaminated hourglass ensured multiple suspects would bear traces of poison. The planted evidence in Miss Thornley's belongings provided an obvious culprit. Even Dr. Fairfax's medical supplies were arranged to appear tampered with. Dr. Fairfax shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag clutched protectively in his lap. Surely you cannot suspect everyone present based on such circumstantial observations. On the contrary, mon docteur, Poirot replied with gentle firmness, I can now eliminate most of those present, through logical deduction. Monsieur Marcus, your weakness is for chance, not careful planning. This crime required a discipline you do not practice. Mademoiselle Thornley, you confessed before compulsion and would not select a method demanding such coolness under scrutiny. Mademoiselle Penelope, love makes for reckless acts, but visible ones, and there was no visible act from you. The psychological net was tightening with each carefully chosen word, and Poirot could sense the murderer's growing desperation beneath their maintained facade. Someone in this room had committed murder with extraordinary calculation, and that same calculating mind was now working frantically to maintain their deception. The killer understood, he announced with quiet certainty, that success required not merely administering poison, but creating what you might call a perfect storm of misdirection. They knew Mrs. Blackwood had already made her final decisions about the will weeks ago. Tonight's performance was their final opportunity to act before complete ruin became inevitable. Moving toward the anteroom door, Poirot called quietly, "Reeves, be so good as to bring us the contents of the ladies' cloakroom, the vanity cases, the small bottles, the atomizers, all the personal items that were set aside upon arrival this evening." A tremor ran through the room that had nothing to do with the storm outside. The soft approach of measured footsteps and the faint clink of glass against metal announced Reeves's return, carrying with him the evidence that would finally expose the calculating mind behind Mrs. Blackwood's precisely timed murder. The widow's hourglass had measured its final hour, and justice was about to claim its own precise accounting. As Reeves entered carrying the silver tray laden with the evening's collected personal effects, Poirot's grey eyes immediately fixed upon the delicate array of vanity cases, perfume bottles, and cosmetic implements arranged before him. With the methodical precision that marked all his investigations, he began examining each item, his fingers hovering over them without quite touching, as if divining their secrets through proximity alone. "Ah," he murmured with quiet satisfaction, lifting a slender silver atomizer with his handkerchief. The device was exquisitely crafted, no larger than a fountain pen, with an elegant pearl inlay that spoke of expensive tastes and theatrical sensibilities. "Here, mes amis, we find our true murder weapon." The atomizer's base bore a narrow metal foot that matched perfectly the linear scratch on the small table beside Mrs. Blackwood's chair. More damning still, traces of crystalline residue clung to its delicate nozzle, the same oily substance that had been found scattered on the Persian carpet near the deceased's final resting place. "Inspector," Poirot announced, "this device contains concentrated digitalis in aerosol form. Most ingenious, it could deliver a lethal dose directly into a glass of cordial with a single silent depression, leaving virtually no visible evidence of tampering." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Each person present stared at the innocent-looking device as if it were a coiled serpent, understanding instinctively that they were looking at the instrument of Mrs. Blackwood's precisely timed death. But it was Celeste Blackwood's reaction that confirmed Poirot's deductions with crystalline clarity. Her theatrical composure, so carefully maintained throughout the evening's ordeal, finally shattered completely. The mask of grief and shock fell away, revealing beneath it a calculating mind that had orchestrated murder with extraordinary precision. "That's not mine," she said too quickly, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone whose perfect plan had just collapsed. "I've never seen that device before in my life." "But, madame," Poirot replied with gentle inexorability, "your fingerprints are upon it, and more significantly, your stage training taught you precisely how to manipulate such devices for dramatic effect. You understood better than anyone how to time a performance for maximum impact." Celeste rose from her chair with the fluid grace of a seasoned performer, but her movements now carried the desperate energy of a trapped animal. "You don't understand," she said, her voice taking on the theatrical projection that had once commanded audiences. "Victoria was going to destroy everything, not just Marcus's inheritance, but my entire future. She had discovered my correspondence with James, knew about the money I'd borrowed against Marcus's expectations, understood that I would be left with absolutely nothing. And so you prepared your revenge with theatrical precision," Poirot continued, his grey eyes never leaving her face. "You contaminated the hourglass to confuse the evidence, planted the digitalis bottle in Miss Thornley's belongings, even arranged for Dr. Fairfax's medical supplies to appear tampered with. But your greatest stroke of genius was understanding that this elegant atomizer would be overlooked among ladies' personal effects. Who would suspect a cosmetic accessory of being a murder weapon? The timing required extraordinary calculation. Inspector Caldwell observed with professional admiration despite himself. "How did you ensure the poison would take effect at precisely the right moment?" "Because, Inspector," Poirot explained, "Madame Celeste understood from her theatrical experience that concentrated digilis and aerosol form acts within minutes, not hours. She administered the fatal dose during those final moments when all attention was focused on the falling sand, knowing that Mrs. Blackwood would collapse just as the hourglass completed its measurement. Perfect dramatic timing for what she believed would be the perfect crime." Celeste's laugh carried the bitter edge of defeat mixed with professional pride. "It would have worked perfectly, if not for your meddling, Monsieur Poirot. Every detail was planned, every contingency considered. Even if the poison had been discovered, there were multiple suspects with stronger apparent motives than mine. Except, Madame, that you underestimated Mrs. Blackwood's final stratagem. She suspected you specifically, which is why she arranged tonight's gathering. She knew that only you possessed both the desperation and the theatrical skill to commit murder with such elaborate misdirection." As Inspector Caldwell placed the handcuffs on Celeste's wrists, she maintained her performer's dignity to the end. "At least I tried to secure some future for myself," she said with quiet defiance. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind the clean silence that follows tempests. As the authorities led Celeste away, Poirot stood before the silent hourglass, its black sand settled in the lower chamber like a final punctuation mark on the evening's dark drama. "And so," he murmured to Hastings as they prepared to depart Ravenshollow Manor, "we see once again that the human heart, when cornered by desperation, can devise the most elaborate deceptions. But truth, like time itself, cannot be permanently contained. It will always find its way to the surface." The widow's hourglass had measured its final hour, and justice had claimed its precise accounting.